Hello, this is Dr. Richards and welcome to Biochemistry. We will be starting here with the first chapter in the book called The Foundations of Biochemistry. So that means we're starting at the very beginning, and that's a good place to start. So let's start by talking about what is biochemistry. And the short answer, it is the chemistry of biological molecules. So you've already had chemistry, so you already know what chemistry means, and maybe you've had biology, and so you already know what I mean by biological molecules. But let's talk about that in more detail. So when we talk about biological molecules, what we really mean is biological or molecules that are unique to living things. So really, our question is, what is life? Now, of course, this is a deep philosophical question that we're not really going to get into in a whole lot of detail in this class. On the other hand, it's a really simple question and probably one you've been asked before. So in most biology classes that you take, usually they start with this question or start with this definition. And what you may have discovered, or you will if you haven't already, is that there are many different definitions of life. And in fact, that is one of the problems with studying life, is that we all know what we mean when we talk about it, but it's actually really hard to define if you try to pin it down. So we'll just go through a basic definition or list of properties of living things that your book uses. It's a good enough definition for the time being. But first of all, life or living things show a unique level of chemical complexity and organization that you don't see in non-living matter. So what that means is that biological molecules and the larger structures that they're assembled into show a degree of complexity that does not exist in any non-living material. Also, biological structures show what we call hierarchical organization, which means that each level is built from simpler and less complex structures. So a cell is made of organelles and large, what we call supramolecular complexes. So that means things like the plasma membrane, the individual organelles, things like ribosomes, chromatin. Those are all supramolecular complexes, but those then are built up of smaller but still complex structures like big proteins. DNA is a good example of that. Complex carbohydrates like cellulose, for example. But each of those is in turn built of simpler monomeric subunits, nucleotides in the case of nucleic acid, amino acids in the cases of protein, and then monosaccharides in the case of complex carbohydrates. And again, each of those is built from then simpler structures. So those monomeric units are built from simple chemical elements. And so when that happens, when you have simple structures organizing into more complex structures that behave in new ways that you couldn't really predict from the simpler structures, we call that emergence. And that's another property of life. Living things have the ability to extract energy and matter from other sources, including the environment or from other living things, and use that for their survival. So when a plant absorbs energy from the sun and CO2 from the air, that is necessary for its survival. But then when that plant gets eaten by an herbivore, then that energy and matter that the plant collected gets transferred to that herbivore, and so on, in the great circle of life. So eventually, even animals that eat other animals die, and their nutrients, their energy and matter turns back into energy and matter for microorganisms and new plants to grow, and so on and so forth. But at each stage, you have living things or life taking energy and matter from other sources and using it. And then living things exhibit structures that have specific functions and that interact with each other in specific ways. And this is true both at the molecular level and at the structural level, or at the organismal level. So when we talk about things like, say, the circulatory system, there are many parts to the circulatory system, and each one has a specific job, and they interact with each other in specific ways. And the same is true down at the molecular level. So you have complex molecular pathways where individual proteins and cofactors all work together in very specific ways to give rise to specific functions. All living things have the ability, or the capacity at least, to detect things in their environment and respond to them. Now, for animals, of course, that means having a nervous system with a complex sensory system. So we have various sensory systems for detecting things in our environment, but even simple organisms like bacteria have a degree of ability to sense their environment. So, for example, a simple slime mold can actually find its way through a maze by detecting food in the culture dish that it's in. And all living things have the ability to self-replicate and exhibit what's called self-assembly. Now, replication doesn't necessarily mean having offspring. So every living thing, at least at the cellular level, has the capacity to self-replicate. So even if you don't have your own children, your cells, many of them right now, are in the process of replicating. And what we mean by self-assembly is all of your cells and tissues organize themselves into the structures that make up your body without having to be put together by some outside force. They contain all the instructions they need to form larger and more complex structures as you grow and develop. And finally, all living things are descended from a common ancestor and are the product of evolution by natural selection. So evolution just means change over time, but we know that organisms change over time, change from generation to generation, and over very long periods of time. They can change from one species to another, and that process we call evolution. And then the appearance of specialized traits that help an organism survive and reproduce in its environment we call natural selection. So any trait that helps an organism live and survive and reproduce in its environment we call an adaptation. And adaptations are, and again, this includes anatomical features, but it even includes molecular features. And these are all the products of this process that we call natural selection. Another property of all living things, with perhaps the exception of viruses, is that they are all made of these building blocks called cells. So a cell, of course, is just a plasma membrane surrounding fluid that we call cytoplasm. So cytoplasm is just the stuff inside the cell, and it's mostly water with just stuff floating in it, which can be just proteins or other types of molecules, and can include large complex organelles depending on the type of cell. There are two main types of cellular organisms, the prokaryotes and the eukaryotes. So here you can kind of see the difference between the two. Prokaryotes are divided into the bacteria and the archaea. They look similar to each other in that they're single-celled prokaryotes, but there are important differences between the two in terms of the structure of their cell wall and other important properties. Also, it turns out that archaea are actually more closely related to the other major group of cellular organisms, which are the eukaryotes. So eukaryotes include all of the multicellular organisms, so that includes us, animals, but also fungi and plants. And then there are a whole bunch of single-celled eukaryotes, which sometimes get called the protists or protozoa. So prokaryotes, again, usually when you're thinking of a prokaryote, you're thinking of bacteria, but this also includes archaea. Again, they're all single-celled, and they have, like all cells, a plasma membrane, but then prokaryotes also have an extra layer around that plasma membrane called a cell wall, and that's the plasma membrane is made of lipid. The cell wall is usually made of some sort of complex polysaccharide, which we'll talk about what those mean later. But together they make up the cell envelope, and different types of prokaryotes have different kinds of cell walls, and some have two layers, some have one. But then on the inside, you have, again, the cytoplasm, which is just the fluid inside the cell, and that contains all the parts of the cell, including the nucleoid, which is just the DNA of the molecule, which is in most bacteria and archaea just a single circular DNA molecule. So even though it's all kind of coiled up, it's just one big giant circular molecule of DNA. And then other important structures inside the prokaryote, all cells contain ribosomes. So ribosomes, as we'll learn later, are structures for creating proteins. And then there are other specialized structures that bacteria can have on the outside. So, for example, pili, which are short structures that are used sometimes for bacteria to attach to each other and to engage in what's called conjugation. So you probably know that prokaryotes, as a rule, reproduce asexually, but they do have the ability to exchange DNA, and they do that through these pili. And then most bacteria have flagella, which are long whip-like structures that they use to propel themselves. So that's their main method of movement. And then eukaryotes also have a cell membrane that's made of lipids. Most eukaryotes do not have a cell wall, but some do. And then on the inside, there are various membrane-bound organelles. So the nucleus, of course, is probably the most important one because it contains the DNA of the cell. And unlike in eukaryotes, in prokaryotes, most eukaryotes have multiple DNA molecules called chromosomes, and those are usually linear, which means they have two free ends. Again, whereas prokaryotes have a single circular DNA molecule. Elsewhere in the cytoplasm, you also have ribosomes, again, that are responsible for making new proteins. And then usually a set of organelles that make up what's called an endomembrane system. So various membrane-bound compartments, including the endoplasmic reticulum and the Golgi apparatus. And their main job is to move stuff around inside the cell. So as new proteins get synthesized and moved around, they go through the endomembrane system. And then other types of organelles like lysosomes and peroxisomes, they're there to help break down waste and other nutrients in the food that comes into the cell. And then mitochondria, which are really special organelles. Their main job is to produce ATP, and we'll talk a lot about that process later. But mitochondria are weird because they have two membranes, and they also have their own DNA. So in fact, there's really good evidence that mitochondria are actually the descendants of prokaryotes that probably started off as either endosymbionts or parasites of some ancestor of eukaryotes and eventually became their own organelles within the cell. And then again, the rest of the fluid inside the cell is just called the cytoplasm. By the way, cytoplasm has two parts to it, the organelles and the structures we just talked about, plus the fluid part, which is sometimes called cytosol. So that's the difference between those two terms. Now, the picture I'm showing up here, the picture you've probably seen before, is just a generic picture of a eukaryote cell. But for the most part, this is what an animal eukaryote cell looks like, as well as some other types of organisms. And then there are lots of specialized kinds of eukaryotes. Plants are especially important because, as we'll talk about later, they can convert energy from light into chemical energy. So they have extra structures that are important. The chloroplasts are the organelles they use to convert light into chemical energy. But plants do also have mitochondria. So the energy they produce from light into chemical energy gets then broken down by the mitochondria. And then organelles called vacuoles, which are there to help degrade and recycle macromolecules and to store metabolites. And in some cells, they're important structural components because they fill with water and give the cell kind of more internal pressure. And then a cell wall, which is an extra layer around the cell membrane. Again, it's kind of like the cell wall of bacteria in that it contains complex carbohydrates, and the cell wall gives the cell its shape and provides some protection. So the reason that plants' leaves have shape and structure to them is mostly due to that cell wall. And then another important part of most cells is the cytoskeleton. Cytoskeleton, the word cyto means cell, and then skeleton means skeleton. So the skeleton in your body is the bones that give your body its shape and structure. So the cytoskeleton of a cell is the proteins inside the cell that give it its shape and structure. And there are different kinds of proteins that make up the cytoskeleton. And different types of cells can have different types of cytoskeletal elements. But the cytoskeleton is made mostly of three kinds of protein. Actin, which is especially important for moving the cell. So whenever cells that have the ability to move in their environment use actin to do that. microtubules are made of a protein called tubulin, and moving stuff around within the cell is mostly carried out by microtubules. Microtubules are especially important for replication. So as cells divide, the chromosomes and other organelles that get distributed during replication are carried out or moved around by those microtubules. And then there's kind of a third class that's just sort of everything else that fits, not classified as one of the other two, called intermediate filaments. And there's lots of types of intermediate filaments, but the intermediate filaments are especially important for multicellular animals because they're involved in cells attaching to each other and attaching to what's called the extracellular matrix. So that's the protein matrix that cells are embedded in when they're in a multicellular tissue. Okay, next time we will talk about how cells and living things use chemical energy.